You kind of already talked about these, but is there any other thing that you learned about yourself in that situation? And I didn't really know too much about the where you went afterwards at the NIH. Mm-hmm. If you want to go into that a little bit, but what did you learn about yourself through this whole process? Obviously, you learned something because at some point you decided, you know what, I don't want to do this.
Yeah, I mean those are some of the most interesting years of my life, and I'm pretty glad that I didn't have my first kid till I was 35. Which on the one hand you sort of think, well, God, I'm so old, like I'm not going to be like the 50-year-old grandfather, right? But on the other hand, I think it's a really good thing because when I think about what was going on in my mid to late 20s, the sort of really difficult decisions I had to make. I mean, leaving medicine after being in it for 10 years was a really difficult decision, especially to go and do something that had nothing to do with medicine. I mean, when I left, I joined a consulting firm, McKinsey & Company, and I did credit risk modeling. Like, I didn't have a thing. The fact that I was a doctor was like a liability. There was no, it was like starting all over again in life. So to get to that point, I had to go through a whole bunch of stuff. So I think, I wouldn't even know where to begin. I mean, I think one thing I learned was, so this fellow that I alluded to earlier, Steve Rosenberg, who is, again, to this day, probably one of the most important mentors in my life outside of family members. Just an amazing human being, right? So just kind of on another level. And I remember even asking him after being in his lab for 2 years, because remember, we had a couple of people in the lab who I just didn't think were that good. They really bugged me. Their existence bothered me. And I finally, after being in the lab for 2 years, worked up the courage to ask him, how because he's like this guy who's going to win a Nobel Prize. Like, he's changing the game. And yet, we had a couple people that I kind of thought were bottom feeders. And I was like, you never get upset at them. Like, ever. I've never seen you get upset at these people. How? And he said, Peter, I just look at everybody and I figure out at least one thing that they can do well, and I just figure out a way to empower them to do that one thing, even if they can't do the 10 things that I would expect you to do. And I remember thinking, I understand in theory what you're saying. I can't do that. I can't tolerate mediocrity. So that was a huge thing that I learned. And it never really hit home again until I was running a nonprofit, because there wasn't a lot of mediocrity at Hopkins, right? Mm-hmm. You sort of had your pick of the best residents there. Everybody there was the best at what they did. You had amazing nurses, amazing residents, amazing respiratory therapists, and everybody there was the best of their field, right? And then I go to McKinsey, same thing. You've kind of got the best of the best all over again. But, fast forward 5 years, I'm now running a nonprofit. Well, all of a sudden, you don't get the best of the best anymore. You're drawing from the third pool. And I remember coming back to that, which is, you know what? You're probably not cut out to do this. You have two choices. Don't be a leader. Just be your own dude. Or be a leader, but only with A players. But this notion of you have the capacity to mentor the C players and maybe turn them into a B+ player. I don't have those genes. I can't do it. and not only that, I will destroy the C player. And I don't mean to, but I will bury them in the ground and become a horrible human to them. So I also realized I can be a really bad person if I don't respect the work that someone's willing to do.
So did you ever have to find a counter to that? Because if you were in the military and you and I were working together, I would be like, hey, Peter, you got to act like Rosenberg.
Yeah.
You got to act like him. Because in the military, you're not getting A players. Yeah. I mean, you got some great guys. In the SEAL teams, you got some great guys that are studs. You got some okay guys that are in the middle. You got some losers down at the bottom. Guess what? You need every single one of them to go on deployment with you. And they all got to give you everything they can. And the more you create conflict with them and the more you are talking down to them, the less they're going to do. You know how they're already a C-level player or a D-level player?
They're going down.
Yeah, they're going down. You're not making them any better. So that's did you ever try and correct that, or do you just go through and say, you know what, you've realized that that's like a weakness of yours?
I want to be clear. There are two attributes that you can be a C player in, and I can cope with one, but I can't cope with the other, and I accept it fully. I can cope with someone who has a C plus intellect. So if you think about the intellect as the CPU of the computer, I don't need everybody to have the fastest CPU. I accept the fact that like we all have different sort of innate capacities to sort of process and do, and we all move at different speeds. I can cope with variability there. Where I cannot cope with variability, or maybe I've just chosen I don't want to, is I can't cope with variability on intent, work ethic, integrity. Like if you can't be an A player there, I actually don't want you in my life anymore. And I think I'm old enough now that I've just said, fuck it. I'm not going to deal with it anymore. Life is too short, and I'm not going to deal with C players who fail on those metrics.
Right.
I don't care how smart you are. But if you can't show up and work your ass off, if you can't be honest, if you can't care, if you can't want to get better, I actually don't want you in my life. So you're right. I think I'm probably not cut out to be a leader, because I can't take those people who are failing on those metrics and work with them.
Well, you just need to be a leader of a very high performing team, not of a regular team. Yeah.
I never had problems, right? So when I was a resident, residency is very hierarchical, right? You've got the med student, the sub-I, the intern, the second year resident, the senior resident, the chief resident, the fellow, the attending. I mean, it's as clear as day who's in charge at any moment in time. And as I'm going up through those ranks, for the most part, I never really had difficulty, with the teams underneath me. But again, I had the luxury of being at Hopkins. Everybody there is the best. The med student, they're the best. The resident, they're the best. McKinsey, same thing. You're dealing with the best of the best. But yeah, running a nonprofit, it was like a totally different world to me. And so I think the difference is a great leader could have succeeded in any environment. They could have done it. They could have figured out, like, okay, the reason this person, like, acts like a lazy sack of shit is actually because of this, and you can like figure out a way to like touch them and help them out of that. And I was just like, yeah, I'm not doing it.
So that's going back to NIH, and that was the first time you dealt with people.
That's the first time I'd sort of seen in a long-term working environment like a couple people who weren't top agents. And again, maybe part of it's because you're in the government at that point. And you get some staff people there, maybe who, and part of it I think was just because Steve Rosenberg was such an amazing guy, and he could get the best out of everybody, that he might have just had a greater tolerance for that. I think the second thing I learned was I would never be a world-class scientist. So when you go to NIH, you're really only going for one reason. I mean, I'm sure there's some people that go there just to check the box and say, I was at the NIH. That wasn't why I went. I went because Steve Rosenberg was my hero. When I was in medical school, I read his book called The Transformed Cell. And I was like, that book along with another book by a guy named Richard Feynman called Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, became kind of two of the most important books, I read during, my 20s. And I actually wouldn't date somebody. I wouldn't date a girl until she read them.
We're gonna go into after the podcast. You and I are gonna go into a full on counseling session. You need help. So
I went to NIH, right, because I was like, look, this, this guy is my God, and like, right, I want to be like that, right? I want to be the best surgeon scientist that ever lived. And then I got there and I realized that surgery and science couldn't be more different. Surgery is the ultimate immediate gratification. Like surgery, you get to fix the problem in hours. Science is a lifetime of work, a lifetime of failure before successes. In fact, one of the most remarkable stories from Rosenberg's book, which of course I read while in medical school, but it wasn't until a decade later when I'm living it that I really understood why he was great and why I couldn't be great, was from when he arrived at NIH in 1974 until he really had his first success was about 10 years. So for 10 years, everything he was trying was failing, and every patient died. every single person that showed up died. Until this one woman in 1984, when finally they figured out how to dose something called interleukin-2, and they finally sort of cracked the first piece of what has turned into a very long code that 30 years later, we're just starting to make really amazing traction on. Now, think about that for a second. 43 years ago, he started that job. For 10 straight years, he just lost. It's like you're going to go play pickup every day for 10 years and lose every day. So what I realized was, actually, I don't have that intestinal fortitude. I cannot fail that frequently and still be at my best the next day. And again, I hate admitting that because it sounds awful. It sounds like I suck, and I guess I suck. But like I realized, like I could be good, meaning I could go after easier problems to solve where you can get grants and just play the game, and that's frankly what most people do in this space. But if you want to change the game, if you want to change mankind, if you want to do something seminal, you have to be willing to fail forever. And I realized, I find that again, it's not that I'm addicted to the win. It's not like, oh, I have to be told good boy, good boy, good boy. But I need some win. I need to know that I have some control over my fate. Whereas in surgery, you have some control over your fate. There is a difference between being a good surgeon and being a bad surgeon. And it's not to say there's not a difference between being a good scientist and a great scientist. But in science, you are far less in control of what's going on than in surgery.
Now, he must have had some long-term vision hypothesis that
he absolutely
was out
did.
there.
Oh, he
that
did.
He believed it.
He laid it out. He said there are 4 things that have to be true if we're going to ever figure out a way to get the immune system to fight cancer. These 4 things have to be true. And if they're not true, the human immune system will never be able to fight cancer. And it took 10 years just to figure out the first proof of concept in a human. So yes, they had a couple of successes in mice where they had demonstrated, okay, at least in mice you can do this. But in cancer biology, you don't get terribly excited about doing stuff in mice for very long. There's a really famous Italian cancer biologist who once famously said, if you can't cure cancer in a mouse, you need a new profession. That's pretty low-hanging fruit. You got to be able to do it in people.